All right. So I put this all together like right back at the beginning of the quarter because I realized we had a lot of stuff unfinished. And one of the reasons I felt that it was costing us velocity is because we'd have to come back to those things like every couple of months. We'd get a community contribution through and you'd have to go back and figure out like, where is this thing? How far along did we get it? Where did we leave it? What status is the feature flag? Is it ready for deployment or not? And especially in the case of things like confidential notes, it started to get quite scary because, yeah, some of it was behind a feature flag, some of it's not behind a feature flag. Technically, there's a little bit of a security issue if somebody did enable it, and so it was better to go through and find out like why some of these things are there and what we could do about it in future. Like what are our kind of blind spots if we have any to kind of prevent this happening in the future? What can we do? So I know you've all read and taken part in the RCA, so we'll go straight into the agenda and won't labor the point anymore. So I have the first item, of course. And I noticed that like 2 of the features that I investigated on the product planning side had stalled for reasons that in the end I couldn't get entirely to the bottom of. But a couple of things jumped out at me. And one of them was that back then we were doing like an extraordinary amount of things, like an extraordinary number of things in each milestone. I went back through some of the iteration planning issues that we did back then. And I noticed how much stuff was going from iteration to iteration. And also like just the breadth of stuff. So we're working on requirements, we're working on epics, service desk, and what else? Yeah, multiple participants and issues, all in the same milestone, all different things, right? All different features. And I think that then what might have happened was we had externalities. So we had headcount resets, we had engineering allocations, redeployment of product managers, and so we weren't robust at all to this. So my first suggested corrective action was a sensible cap, whatever that is, per team, whatever, on new deliverables per milestone. Specifically, like not the number of new deliverables, but the type, right? So if we're working on like epic links, we're working on epics, right? If we're working on like requirements, satisfying requirements manually, like we're working on requirements for that milestone. Yes, so I'll open it up to the floor. Any thoughts on this?
Are you thinking that?
Oh,
go ahead, Melissa. You first.
Thank you. So I think it depends on the items and the milestone, honestly. Like there will be milestones where you do have these big chunky deliverables, right? But there are going to be milestones where you have sort of like smaller things, like even product planning. This milestone, we have like 4 smaller kind of buckets, whereas last milestone we had 1 big one, right? So I don't know if there can be a blanket rule, so to say, of like limiting the themes, but maybe what we can think about is like not loading to the full velocity, but I put 75% on notes as an example, but it can be whatever we decide, right? But basically having a little bit more room by not loading up. The other thing that I want to bring up is that if we get into a situation where things are slipping from milestone to milestone, that's something that we definitely need to retro and figure out what's going on, right? And not just kind of like keep rolling. And I know like in project management, y'all have done things like have a catch-up milestone, right? But I think that's one of the things that we need to be sort of watching and acting on as it's happening.
Can I just ask though, why not 1 large deliverable per milestone? Like, why not try to aim for that, right? Because if I look at our last 3 milestones, I would say that last milestone was epic links. This milestone, or say 15.0 for confidential notes, 15.1 for parent hierarchies. Like there's the whole team know that like they might be working on different things, but they know like what the big effort is for the whole team. And the last few milestones, that's really worked for us.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe we could aim for that. But I guess I'm hesitant to say it's always going to be that way. But maybe that can be what we try to do consciously.
I've always had two themes, like, because I know like when you just have one thing that not everyone can work on the one thing. And I've gotten feedback from engineers that they prefer to have a couple different themes, so that way like you can hop around or at least have a couple DRIs for each one. And so I've always tried to have two themes. But I've noticed that even when we do that, like issues regularly slip, and we regularly don't deliver on what we say we want to accomplish for the release, which is a whole other thing. But typically how this is solved for in traditional agile planning is using weight and velocity, right? So knowing what the velocity of the team is, understanding if issues and epics that are like big things are refined enough to where they're weighted. We know our velocity is 25, right? We can look across all the work that needs to be done and pick out 25 worth of weight that we want to commit to as something that's like a deliverable. And that can be all one theme, or it could be a bunch of small stuff. But that's like, I do agree with not allocating 100% of capacity, right? Always leaving slack in the system, because like systems that operate at 100% are actually really inefficient. So I'm always game for that. But those are just some of my random thoughts.
How do you
So
find
if I can ask like the PM question, it's like with limiting themes, what are you hoping to achieve, John?
What am I hoping to achieve? Limiting themes. It's kind of similar to the work in progress limits that we did, like as absolute limits on queues, except you're saying that we're going to put it onto a theme. So in other words, like you're not like as an engineer working for a week and a half on requirements and then having to switch quickly to a bug that's in epics, right? Like you, because there's a cost to context switching, and you pay that overhead every time you context switch. And like most of the time, like they'll have 2 things or 3 things on the go at one time. So you want to cluster them together so they're roughly in the same wheelhouse.
Understood.
I think that's why I would say limit themes. I also think that like in a remote environment, it's like it took me like 3 years, whatever it is, to realize this, like that it isn't always easy to know what the most important thing is to work on when you come to work in the morning or whenever you work. And when the whole team has like one deliverable, they know that like how to prioritize work, right? They don't need to ask anybody or even look at the board. They know instinctively that if we've set a goal to deliver epic links by the end of the milestone and they have 2 options in front of them, they know which is the most important option to work on first thing, with almost no need for information radiators or consultation with managers, things like that. And I think that's really powerful and useful. I also think that just because you focus on one thing, like, doesn't mean that you only work on one thing, right? Like, Epic Links had a bunch of follow-up issues that weren't necessary for the MVC, but did need to be done. Those get bumped into the next milestone. So when you get to the next milestone, you have your big deliverable, your follow-ups from the previous milestone, which you still have some context on, provided you schedule them right away. And then you have your bug security issues and performance tests that you're trying to burn down as well. So like if you're just delivering one thing, like you still have plenty of other work to do, but it just narrows the focus a little bit, you know.
And that's strictly around the single deliverable. Then it's not to say that for a milestone, we're only going to get stuff done associated with that deliverable. They can still, like engineers can still pick stuff that are somewhat unrelated to that deliverable for the non-deliverable work that needs to get done in that milestone. Does that make sense? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, so there's like a couple of actionable things that I hear. One is like trying to be intentional around the subject area, even if it's not a single theme, right? But just the subject area to reduce context switching is 1. 2 is that it is important to have something that is the most important thing in a milestone, right? Even if we have other work, but just having one thing that you can kind of rally around. I think we can do that. What do you think, Gabe and Mark?
Yeah. The other thing that I try to do in terms of like to help that, and I just did it in this one, 15 out of 0 planning, because Mario actually asked me the question. He's like, what are the relative priorities of these things, right? And I was just like, oh, cool, that's a great question. And then I like basically listed out like, here's the things like relative priority that we need to do, and I put that at the top of basically above the themes. So that way, like anybody looking at that knows like this is the highest thing that we need to do, and then this, and then this, even though there's like all these things in these different kind of themes from quality of life to iteration cadences and work items. I'm fine limiting that down even further to just one. Like once iteration cadences are kind of launched, then I think we can just, I'm hoping we can have just one, which will be work items for a long time. But I'm fine doing that.
I mean, I don't really have a problem limiting to one theme. I think the theme from Certify has been pretty much the same thing, which is let's get requirements finally shipped. So I don't think there's been any confusion there. I'm happy to continue with that. I realize that there's some blockers and some limitations with that. So I think that's where it becomes difficult, is even if we have one main theme that is the most critical thing to the business at any given point, and we flow that theme, if it does become blocked, then by default, we need to have other things. So understanding how to prioritize those other things in a way that keeps progress moving is, I think, really important. Just to ensure that we're not getting distracted with the secondary things when something gets blocked and then never going back to the primary. So I guess we just need to make sure we're on that same page. But yeah, I have no problem planning that way.
I think to give my perspective on that as well would be, if there's one thing coming up, like I can assign a DRI to that a month ahead, right? But if there are 3 things coming up, I can't realistically do that, because you're giving capacity from your current milestone to that effort, right? To plan that thing in advance. And it's particularly useful for what you said there, Mark. I think like if there are blockers upcoming, like you can de-risk it as much as possible by doing a spike the month in advance and trying to identify those blockers. And if some of them are such hard blockers that we can't go ahead and do it the next milestone, then we just shouldn't do it, right? Until those blockers are gone.
Well, I think that's the thing. I think what we need to really have is a good feedback mechanism. And I think that's what we might be lacking here. Because things like requirements, recognizing that there's migrations involved. So it's a really good example. It's something that has to be spread out over a series of milestones, because we have to do certain migrations in each milestone and basically nothing else. Like it's just, that's how the nature of the situation. But we need to make sure that feedback mechanism is incredibly crisp, so that we say, okay, we're going to absolutely ensure that this next step gets taken in the next milestone, even if it's just this tiny little piece, because it has to get done that milestone to free up for the next milestone. And I think if we can get that into a really crisp and clear prioritization framework in a way that everybody understands, these things can't be missed no matter what, because then it pushes, downstream work even further. And then we can pick a theme for the milestone aside from that. I think that makes a lot of sense. We just need to make sure that everybody's on the same page there. And I think that's where we've probably, mainly due to myself being only part-time on this, it's not been as crisp as it needs to be. So.
I have a question. Are we defining a deliverable as something that is going to be delivered to a user, or just a piece of work that we're going to get done in a certain time? Like, so say we have something that we know is going to take like 4 milestones, and there's no way to really break it down into something that we can provide to the customer, to a user within a milestone. Would we consider the milestone chunk that doesn't get to a user a deliverable, or the entire long living feature to be the deliverable?
I mean, the way we've documented it right now, and from everything I've read, a deliverable is an agreed upon piece of work that will be completed in that milestone. It does not have to be a release post item. It does not have to be a customer facing feature. So in that sense, we could commit to a deliverable of making one more step in requirements migrations, and that might just be 2 days worth of work for somebody, and then there's nothing more they can do that milestone. But that was the deliverable agreed upon. That's being delivered. We've succeeded in that deliverable. recognizing that it doesn't actually impact our customers in any way, shape, or form, but it's absolutely critical to maintain this cadence, or else things just keep slipping. So we've tagged it as a deliverable, we've prioritized it as a deliverable, and therefore the goal is to deliver that because it is necessary either to a customer-facing feature or to a downstream effort that is, in progress.
Yeah, like a good example was we had scheduled the architecture spike for widgets for 1410, and that's blocking us doing anything beyond the first MVC of tasks because we can't do descriptions or assignees or any of that stuff until that's like agreed upon. We figure out how we want to do that technically, and we didn't start it. So now like we have to wait. It's going to be at least 15.1 or probably 15.2 before we can take the next customer facing MVC of tasks, right? And that's sort of like, I think the feedback mechanisms, I guess, in terms of like prioritization and how that impacts future things is, to Mark's point, really important to think about.
Okay, in some of the RCAs that we've done for some of these features, do we feel that, or was it found that having these longer living features that extend to beyond a single milestone before we see any real like user impact or user value, like have you all found that to be one of the issues as to why we have unfinished features, because they go for so long that they kind of just get deprioritized? Like it's hard to kind of waterfall this work to get it done in the future. Or do you all not?
From my perspective, it's been a huge problem. And I think the issue is we made a commitment about a year ago to migrate to work items, and it's taken on a lot of different forms. And I think we've made iterative improvements, and I think I'm very satisfied with how the decisions that have been made. I think they're the right decisions made at the right time. The difficulty is there's no customer facing output until we come out the other end. And with these long-lived things, it's very easy for anybody, product, engineering, whoever, to get distracted by some shiny new feature that would give immediate value. And that's not wrong. The problem is that just delays ever getting value out of all this effort we've put in. So right now, we're actually in a bit of debt right now. We've done a lot of work that hasn't really netted from a requirements perspective, and I know it has other places, any significant change. And that's a difficult position to be in. We're going to get it all back once we deliver, but until then, we're just accruing this debt. And it's easy to kind of keep pushing the debt down the road because, hey, we can release this tomorrow and get value immediately. It's just very hard. When you have these long-running projects, it's very difficult to achieve that final conclusion because they do take forever. And then people think, well, if it took 8 months already, what's another month? And that's not wrong. It's just a difficult mentality.
I'm aware of time. Do we want to skip the second one and have a separate async chat about community contributions and how we can deal with those? Like, because it seems like it's a whole separate topic, whereas Gabe's is kind of related to what we're talking about already. Does that make sense? Cool. Gabe, do you want to talk about anything specific to do with OR filtering or iteration cadences?
Yeah, I updated the issue with sort of more context there. But I think in sort of both of these, I think with the OR filtering, the problem is that we never did like a clear refinement, right? And then like we then split FE and backend issues out, and then we got feedback that we needed to kind of make some changes with the UI, but like the time for all that stuff to happen was months. And then we were 3 months into it and learned that we were blocked by the issue list, the view issue list, and we should never have started in the first place, right? And so I put in the release plan for like 5 releases in a row and was like, but it sort of just fizzled out for lots of different reasons. And I think that's where I am in agreement with things that are epic level to have a DRI engineer do a spike on it, but also have whoever does the spike be the one who owns at least the first initial MVC of it, right? So that way they have the context. That's sort of what happened with iteration cadences, where Alexandru took the lead from back end and split a bunch of stuff out but then got allocated to workspaces, and then all of it kind of sort of got lost, right? And we lost the momentum. And there's like a lot of things I think I learned from that. But like, I'm noticing with like a lot of things that end up slipping, it's because there's not enough consensus on how something is going to be built, and then like what steps need to be taken to build it. So then we get into like places like where we are now, and we're uncovering, like with work items, for example, we can't launch tasks because the URL like basically breaks in various places. And it's almost like we didn't uncover that until 3 days before the code freeze. And so some of those things I almost like wonder if it is the spikes are really important. And then also having clear DRIs be responsible for like refinement and documenting the steps to take. So that way anybody who does come behind them knows what needs to be done, what decisions were made, and like what sort of the architecture direction is, or something like that would be really helpful, I think.
Whenever I hear that requirements kind of like become more apparent as the work continues, I always think like somebody should have just asked you a question at some point prior to this, like to clarify, right? And one of the things that the spike allows is like 1 month of interaction between PM and engineer to directly feed back to each other. Do you know what I mean? Like it's, at the minute, it feels a little bit like PM sets the requirements, engineer sort of organize as best they can around those requirements, and then they start the work and a whole bunch of complexity is revealed.
Yep.
Whereas like you kind of set some time aside and you shorten the feedback cycle and you say like, okay, it's like now 24 hours instead of being in the middle of the milestone. When you find out that this requirement can't be satisfied, do we want to do something else?
Yes, I think that I've always found it most effective when we are able to effectively talk about trade-offs, whether what we're prioritizing and scheduling as a whole, or how something's going to be built. Because like in my mind, I always have an assumption about how something should work, right? It's not reality. There could be an easier way that an engineer figures out how to do it, or there's complexity that I don't understand. And so like the more that you have those feedback loops between product and engineering, and the earlier on, the more efficient and effective everything else that comes from that is. So
I also think we're in a place where we have a pretty well-defined, almost like year in front of us, right, with work items. So we can do some of that more like deliberate 1 month ahead planning of what we want to be next. So I think it's doable for us to almost every milestone have a spike on something, right? Like the next thing that we're going to be working on.
Yeah. So what if we do that instead of just having one deliverable or one theme per group per milestone? We aim for one deliverable per milestone and then one spike that will turn into the deliverable for the following milestone.
that's fine for me, because like Melissa said, I can tell you in rough, I mean, I'm open to engineering feedback on like the rough sequencing of things, but we can literally sequence out the work probably for the next 12 months if we wanted to. And it's all very known. There's some things we still need to validate, like what we want the UI to look like, but technically speaking, like we sort of know everything that we need to do. I'm sure that will change, so we don't want to go too far out. But I think there is really clear alignment on that, so that would be good.
Yeah, and as part of that, and we probably should have, well, we can't next week when we have the new UX designer, but UX should also be heavily involved in the spike and with coming up or helping with designs during that that planning milestone or spike milestone.
Yep, that's one thing that Holly said that she was always found lacking is, or struggle with, is how to get engineering more involved earlier when she was working on design stuff. And I think that would be a great mechanism, alignment mechanism, to give the designer, the engineer, like for and the PM all for sort of collaboration in the validation track, like 1 month before things start, or we want to prioritize doing it.
Awesome. That's a cool corrective action. Anyway, any anyone got other corrective actions to suggest, or do we just take this one and try to implement it?
The capacity thing we discussed.
To take what, like which one though?
Oh,
Organizing at
basically,
75%.
yeah, not load to 100%. I don't know what the right number is, right? We can
Yeah.
iterate on that, but
You know
I
what's
just said
funny?
75 as a swag.
When we did epic links, I think it was, I need to go back and check, but our velocity that month took off. Like, I mean, it was like 50% higher or something. And when you talk to the engineers about that and you look at the retrospective and all the feedback was so positive from my direct reports anyway. It was just everybody thought it was excellent to be able to
Having
collaborate
focus.
that way. Yeah, have that kind of level of focus, a shared goal. You know, the human element of this, like, you can't, hard to quantify, but also hard to ignore. Like, I mean, when you have a goal and everybody's aligned on the goal and the goal is like completely clear, yeah, just it's just a much faster and more satisfying way to work. So yeah, I can look at that as well. So what I'll do is I'll put both of those action items into the issue then, and we can take it from there. Like, if we want to put it on the team page or wherever we want to put it, like, to enforce this in the future. So
the other one, I don't know how to make this a corrective action, but I know it is a root cause, and looking at a lot of things, especially like, is maintaining a stable team. So like, iteration cadences probably would have shipped a long time ago if Alexander didn't have to get allocated to workspaces. A lot of the stuff like the OR filtering stalled because Heinrich got allocated the database stuff. And some of this is outside of our control, but the more we can have and maintain a stable team, the more effective, I think, like, inconsistent we'll be in delivering things, right? Because that's also context switching, right? Like, and it's really expensive. So
yeah, and like, far down below that, but also a factor, and I wouldn't like recommend as a corrective action, is that, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that we had 0 security issues, and the milestone after we got that, we did epic links in 1 milestone. I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm not saying it's the only thing. It's just one less thing to focus on, one less piece of context switching. You know, and it all adds up. I'm not saying that we go now and we burn down every other queue of tech debt and bugs, like, as much as I'd love to, but it's just a data point. Cool. We can leave it there if you would like. Thanks everyone for showing up and giving it your best. I really appreciate it. I especially appreciate the effort it requires to fill in a markdown table with this level of information.
And thank you, John, for the OKR, I guess, in facilitating this. I think it's really helpful, and I think we should do it more often, maybe in smaller batches.
Yeah,
you know,
sounds
but
good.
it's cool.
Sounds good.